Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this very prestigious series of talks promoting the Bee Improvement Programme. So my title tonight is Global Pandemics, Bee Imports and Native Bees. And this is based on an article that I wrote, which was published in the July 2020 edition of Beecraft. And I would recommend that you get hold of that if you haven't seen it, mainly because it has references to many of the papers that I will be talking about tonight. So why was I prompted to write this article? Well, two reasons really. The first one really is the Healthy Bees Plan. And as many of you know, this Healthy Bees Plan was produced by DEFRA. It says here March 2009, and that really guides policy and what happens to bee health in England and Wales. And this was supposed to be a 10-year plan, but it got slightly extended, but it actually ran out in March 2020, and a new plan is in progress. And I was vaguely involved in producing the Healthy Bees Plan in more than 10 years ago. And one of the key disappointments for me was that it really said nothing at all about bee breeding. I tried to convince the powers that be that actually bee breeding and queen rearing are quite important to bee health. But at the time it was felt that really they had no place in something that was totally about the health of bees. And I'll come back to that at the end. The second reason why I was interested in writing this paper, of course, is that viruses are very much in the news. And this is a wonderful computer model of a human virus, but not so dissimilar from viruses that affects bees. This, of course, is severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, causes coronavirus disease 2019, or COVID-19. And this has really raised awareness of viruses in general, and is, of course, the reason why I'm talking to you tonight on my computer and not in some hall somewhere. But viruses don't only cause trouble for humans, they cause trouble for bees as well. And I've been vaguely working on viruses of bees for many, many years, since I started at Rothamsted, in fact. And at that time, people weren't really terribly interested in bee viruses, probably because they were really difficult to work on. And Rothamsted Experimental Station, where I worked, was one of only a tiny handful of labs around the world who had the capability to look at viruses. And so lots of scientists, I think, pretended that they didn't exist. But in recent years, with the development of lots of very advanced molecular techniques, many labs around the world have suddenly become very interested in viruses. And this website here belongs to part of the Colos Association, which is the largest association for bee scientists and bee extension specialists in the world. And this is talking about the Virus Task Force, which was founded a few years ago, specifically to look at problems of viruses and how they relate to losses of honeybees. And so when this group came together a few years ago, the first thing it decided it would do would be to write some definitive reviews of what is known, what is the state of the art, the state of our knowledge about viruses. And it just so happens that the first two of these reviews came out earlier this year, so are very topical. So the first one here, written by all these authors from all these different countries, is called Diversity and Global Distribution of Viruses of the Western Honeybee, Apis mellifera. And this is well worth getting hold of, and the references in the Beecraft article. And it really looks at, what we know about the range of different viruses and where they are. There's lots of useful information in there, but I'm just going to show you this one graph, this one map. And these 4 viruses here, they've picked out as being the most economically important affecting honeybees. So this is black queen cell virus. This is deformed wing virus. This, it says here, is the ABP complex, so it means acute paralysis virus, and other related viruses such as Kashmir bee virus and Israeli acute paralysis virus and sac brood virus. And they put these in here because these are the most widely distributed viruses and therefore of the most important. Deformed wing virus, of course, is the most important virus in relation to the varroa mite, and acute bee paralysis virus, Kashmir bee virus and Israeli acute paralysis virus are also very important. They can be transmitted by varroa, but they can occur on their own. Israeli acute paralysis virus was almost certainly the virus that caused concern about colony collapse disorder in the United States in 2006 or so, and really launched the current interest in colony losses. And the important thing about these distributions shown on these maps is that these are not natural distributions. For example, acute paralysis virus complex, the different viruses that come under that, we now know are regional variants of the same thing. So, for example, Kashmir bee virus was originally isolated in South East by my former colleagues at Rothamsted. Acute bee paralysis virus comes from Europe and was identified by my colleagues at Rothamsted. Israeli acute paralysis virus was originally isolated in Israel. All these things were given different names at the time, but now with the benefit of modern molecular techniques, we know they're closely related and they're regional variants. So, you know, an Asian virus is now widely spread around the world. In fact, all 3 of these viruses now occur in the UK, which is certainly not a natural situation. And as I say, Israeli acute paralysis virus almost certainly caused the concern about colony collapse disorder in the United States a few years ago. So these have moved from place to place because people have moved bees from place to place. And we know a lot about the distribution of deformed wing virus. It was discovered again by my former colleagues at Rothamsted in the 1970s. You know, it was really a laboratory curiosity, but when varroa came along and lots of bees with deformed wings were seen, it was realized that the 2 are closely related, and really wherever varroa has spread around the world, deformed wing virus has followed very swiftly afterwards. And now, of course, we know that there are lots of interesting regional variations of deformed wing virus as well. And other people have described things such as Krukago virus and Varroa destructor virus, which we now know are variants of deformed wing virus. So this pattern is due to people moving things around the world. So the second review by the Kolos group is called Routes of Infection in Hymenoptera. So it's not solely related to honeybees, but it is talking about bee viruses. And it's talking about the ways that these can be transmitted from bee to bee, from one species of bee to another, and from bees to other Hymenoptera, that's wasps and so on, and between each other. So the paper contains this really useful graphic here showing how these things are related. So this is a flower here, and over here we have social bees, we have our honeybees, here are 2 colonies, and this is looking at how a virus can be transmitted between colonies by drifting. It will move vertically within the colony, perhaps from queen to offspring, and perhaps back again. These honeybees visit the flowers. Then you have vectors such as Varroa that can transmit viruses. And then you have other species of bees as well. So here we have bumblebees, and we can have viruses moving within bumblebee colonies, between bumblebee colonies, between bumblebees and honeybees by robbing. So honeybees may rob bumblebee colonies, and bumblebee colonies may rob honeybee colonies. Bumblebees have social parasites, cuckoo bees, that can pick up viruses and return them. And these, of course, visit flowers, and on the flowers, viruses can be transmitted to wasps, which again can transmit them vertically within the colonies. And then over here we have non-social bees. We have here solitary bees nesting in holes in the ground or in hollow holes in hollow logs. And each of these will transmit them within their own population, but also through flowers, can mix. And then there are other pollinators, not even hymenopterans, such as hoverflies, that can then pass these things around. And we now know that these so-called bee viruses can be extremely mobile. And so certain viruses, such as slow paralysis virus, which were originally described in honeybees, and were in this country certainly very important in the early days of Varroa, we now think actually originated in bumblebees, namely Bombus lapidarius. So just because they're called bee viruses doesn't mean they originally came from bees, and you know, there are viruses that seem to be more common in bumblebees than in honeybees, and vice versa. So moving on to an example of a particular bee virus. This looks, firstly, we don't have a wonderful computer generated model of this virus, but also it looks very different from the human SARS virus we looked at earlier. This is a strange blobby sort of virus, very irregular in shape. And this one is chronic bee paralysis virus. And this was one of the first bee viruses to be described by my former colleagues at Rothamsted in the 1960s. And it causes a condition called bee paralysis, which actually has been known about and was described by Greek authors nearly 2,000 years ago. So it's something that's been around a very long time. But more recently, in the last 100 years or more, it caused serious problems in Britain. This is a healthy bee here, and here are two syndromes of the symptoms of chronic bee paralysis virus. This bee has a very distended abdomen, bloated abdomen, and then this one has a black, hairless, shiny appearance, and wings sticking out at a funny angle. And this virus almost certainly caused the Isle of Wight disease. And here is a picture of the Isle of Wight disease, which was certainly very common more than 100 years ago, in the period before the First World War, but was blamed for wiping out a very large proportion of the bees in the British Isles, and we'll come back to it later. But the interesting thing about chronic bee paralysis virus is that after the First World War, it seemed to disappear. And we know that the number of honeybee colonies declined rapidly after the First World War. And some of my statistician former colleagues at Rothamsted put together a convincing argument that the incidence of the disease was closely related to the number of honeybee colonies. And as the number of colonies declined, so the importance of the disease declined as well. And I can say from when we were working in the 1990s that chronic bee paralysis virus was really rather uncommon. However, that's not been the case in recent years, and in particular the bee farmers over the last few years have been reporting seeing lots of chronic bee paralysis virus bees, and they tried to get the National Bee Unit interested, and as a result, this next paper came out quite recently. The lead author, Giles Budge, of course, used to be at FERA, part of the National Bee Unit, and he's now at the University of Newcastle, but there are other people from the National Bee Unit here. And so this is entitled Chronic Bee Paralysis as a Serious Emerging Threat to Honeybees. And what they're saying here is that chronic bee paralysis virus has increased in incidence in recent years and should now be regarded as an emerging disease, which is a very trendy phrase in use at the moment if you want to successfully get a grant to study it. However, as I've pointed out, it's actually been around a very long time, but nonetheless their data are very interesting, and they do indeed. So this is based on inspection records from the bee inspectors in the period 2006 to 2017, and they do show that the bee inspectors who recorded chronic bee paralysis virus syndromes symptoms in apiaries, you can see that the number of apiaries steadily and really exponentially for part of this increased in the last 10 years, a significant increase. And they also broke this down. This is on the basis of the number of apiaries per 1,000 visits. They broke it down into what they split into what they call amateur beekeepers and professional beekeepers, and they've split it to those which were done randomly as part of their normal duties, and when they were called out by the beekeeper saying there's something wrong with my bees. And the interesting factor that emerges here is that the professional beekeepers had significantly higher proportion of their apiaries showing chronic bee paralysis virus than did the amateur beekeepers. And perhaps one explanation for this might be that commercial beekeepers tend to keep more hives in an apiary, a higher density of hives per unit area than the amateurs do. And I've already said that there seems to be good evidence that the incidence of this disease is related to the number of colonies. And so that fits quite nicely from what we already know. But the other interesting factor that the authors bring out is that, of course, they have access to where bees have been imported, where queens have been sent, and they found that there was a higher incidence of chronic bee paralysis virus in beekeepers who had introduced new queens or colonies from elsewhere in the last few years. And if we put all that data on a map as they've done, this green here is very low incidence, and the white and pink and yellow are higher incidences. And you can see that over the last 10 years, as they say, the incidence has increased. But it's really very enlightening to look at the patterns here. And for example, in 2010, there's this white hot spot here suddenly appearing, and then over the next few years that tails out, and then we have other spots appearing and then disappearing. Look at this one here in 2015, which disappears again. And this seems to be a pattern of new outbreaks of the disease, which then over the next few years disappear. It certainly doesn't suggest a pattern of a focus of disease and then the disease spreading around the country. It seems to be a series of individual little outbreaks that burn for a while and disappear again. And that would indeed seem to fit quite well with the idea that these are imports of disease from elsewhere. And looking at the data on a slightly different way, they've looked at the relative risk of chronic bee paralysis virus over the same period, but you see the same pattern. So you see this blue pattern here in 2010, and then it becomes paler and disappears, and then there are other outbreaks which again disappear over time. So this link to imports really does seem quite convincing, but what are the possible explanations? Well, really there are two possibilities to explain the results. The first one is the most obvious, and the disease directly brought in imported disease. Well, yes, that's a likely possibility, but of course, as I've said, chronic bee paralysis virus has been around a very long time, and we certainly know it's been in Britain for at least 100 years or more, and we know that it's present in many other countries around the world because there are surveys. So that's not entirely convincing. But the other explanation, of course, is that imported bees are more susceptible to local strains of disease. So in other words, the disease is already here, but when you bring in bees that are more susceptible to it, they go down with the disease. And that is entirely plausible. Do we have any evidence to support that idea? Well, yes, we do, actually. So coming back to the Colos Association that I mentioned before, as well as a group looking at viruses, it has a group looking at bee breeding, which is called the Research Network for Sustainable Bee Breeding. And this started out even before Colos came along with the idea that perhaps one of the reasons why beekeepers are suffering unacceptably high colony losses is that they're keeping bees that are not suitable for their local conditions. And so this group has been working away ever since and has done many interesting studies, but I just want to talk about one large-scale study that was done a few years ago, which was called the Colos Genotype Environment Interactions Experiment. And as I've said, often when talking to beekeepers all around the world, the thing that strikes me is that beekeepers like arguing about things, and particularly, you know, if they've had a convivial evening with a glass of wine or two or a few beers, beekeepers start arguing. And one of the things that they will argue about is this idea that one type of bee is better than another. And of course, such arguments until recently were totally futile because nobody had done an objective experiment testing bees under standardized conditions. So the Colos GEI experiment, as it was called, was set up to do precisely that. So at all these different sites around Europe, each of which had its local strain of bee, the scientists decided to compare at each site 3 strains of bee. So the local strain of bee, whatever it happened to be, with 2 other strains of bee from within the study. And they picked bees that ought to do quite well there. So in Toulouse here, they were not taking the bees from Finland, they were using bees that ought to do quite well there. But the whole point was that these colonies were to be tested under standardized conditions. So they started with 12 colonies of each of 3 strains at each site, and these were tested under standardized conditions for several years. They were not treated for Varroa, but otherwise they were managed according to the normal local practice in that area. And at the end of the 3 years, everything was assessed. And eventually in May 2014, this special issue of the Journal of Apicultural Research was published, which had a number of key papers going through the key results of this experiment. And as I say, there are something like 8 detailed papers here, and I would recommend you go and get hold of them. They are open access and are available, but I don't have time to talk about them. But I'm just going to talk about one key result, and this is looking at the survival of these bees. And so in this graph, we start off at the start of the project, and 3 years later, the end of the project, we start with 100% of the colonies, and as time goes on, those colonies die off. And I should say there were 600 and something colonies in this. So this data is from 670 colonies, I think. And it's, in this instance, been split into those that were the local bees at each site and all the other ones. And the key feature of this is that we have this really quite significant, and this is statistically and consistently statistically significant difference between the two. So at each site, whatever the strain of bee you started with, the local strain of bees survived better than the non-local ones. Well, now, why should that be? It's actually quite difficult to explain, and lots of the factors that might seem obvious, which were looked at individually, do not appear to have had a significant effect on that. But one thing that does stand out is the incidence of disease. And the experiment demonstrated that really most of the bee diseases were present in most of the sites to a greater or lesser extent. But at this one particular site in Greece, much more detailed sampling for disease was done, and does help to cast more light on it. So here we have 4 strains of bee that were present at this site. We have Carniolan bees from V, wherever that was, Ligurian, so it's an Italian strain from somewhere, and then we have 2 Greek strains. These bees came from Bulgaria, and this is the local strain for this site, the Greek Macedonica. And so looking at the number of varroa, you see initially there was some variation, and the local bees actually had a lower population. But over the next year, there were quite high incidence of varroa, and you could imagine that the local ones are a bit lower here. But when we start looking at deformed wing virus, things are slightly more interesting, and you see the local strain here has lower incidence. When you have lots of varroa, you get lots of deformed wing virus, and by this time some of these bees are beginning to die off, but you see the local strain has smaller amounts than the non-locals. This is acute bee paralysis virus, and you see the non-local bees tend to have a much larger incidence here, and by this point you have the local strains which have a much lower incidence. So what this seems to be showing is that although there are, just as there are local strains of bees, there are also local strains of disease. And the most obvious explanation for what happened seems to be that these Greek bees were better adapted to the Greek strains of these common diseases that occur everywhere than were the other ones, even the same subspecies of bee from elsewhere, from some distance away. And interestingly, though that study was done in Europe, where honeybees are native, but the same thing seems to apply in North America, where honeybees are not native. They were all imported, and people have suggested that because they were imported, therefore there's very little variation between them. But you know, honeybees have been in North America for 400, 500 years, which is long enough for natural selection to produce local genotypes. And this very recent study seems to suggest that that's the case. So these people were in New York State and Vermont in North America, and they were comparing their local strain of bee produced, bred in Vermont, with non-local strains of bees produced in California. And this, as in the Kolos study, is looking at load of nosema, and you can see straight away that the local bees seem to have a much lower incidence of nosema than the non-local. And initially they had a smaller amount of varroa, although the varroa was then treated and didn't vary much. But if we look at some of these other diseases, the pattern is quite striking too. So deformed wing virus, the non-local bees seem to have a higher incidence. Black queen cell virus, I don't think these are significant, but look at this one here, Israeli acute paralysis virus. As I say, the virus which almost certainly caused colony collapse disorder in the United States. You can see a huge, highly significant difference between these two in the incidence of Israeli acute paralysis virus. So this definitely seems to occur in bees in North America, just as it does in Europe. So moving on to the question of whether we should import queens into the UK. First of all, what extent is this a problem? How many queens do we import? So I was a couple of years ago involved in the early stages of a project called EURBEST, which in fact concludes next spring and really is a follow-on study from the Kolos GEI experiment, but is looking at variation in commercial bee colonies, so there should be some interesting results in that. But right at the start, the EU, who funded it, wanted to know what was the market for reproductive material in Europe. So I and a number of other people did this search looking for official data from various sources, but also talking to people in each individual EU member state to ask what they knew about the market for queens, package bees, and so on. And it's quite interesting to discover that the official figures do seem to rather vary depending on where you look, and also the official figures seem to vary from the experience of people on the ground. So it was an interesting project. And hopefully we will publish that paper very soon. But looking specifically at England and Wales from official figures, here is the pattern for imports of queens from so-called third countries outside the EU. And you can see that the number has declined quite rapidly in recent years. I'm not entirely sure why, but the corollary is that the number imported from EU member states, and therefore the total, has really quite significantly increased over the last few years. And in fact, we know the missing years after that have shown a big increase as well. So definitely a big increase. So as I say, imported queens from non-EU countries used to be from Hawaii and Australia and New Zealand. But more recently have come from Argentina for reasons that are not entirely clear. But as I say, over the last 10 years or so, a huge number of queens have been coming in from various European countries, mainly Denmark, Greece, Italy, Romania and Slovenia, but also from a lot of other countries. So why has there been this dramatic increase in queen imports over the last 5 years? Well, I'm not really entirely sure. There certainly hasn't been a commensurate drastic increase in the number of beekeepers in that period. I can only conclude that simply more beekeepers are importing more queens and replacing more queens than they used to. Why are they doing that? I can only presume that people are perhaps selling competitively priced queens, and other people are suggesting that actually you should go out and do so. But we do need to put this into perspective. So from the UK hive count figures, which we now seem to have relatively accurate figures, which suggests the most recent count I saw said we got 253,000 colonies. So all these queen imports actually relate to about 6% of the queens replaced each year. And then we do produce some queens. The suggestion is we produce about 10,000 a year in England and Wales, and maybe another 2,000 in Scotland, which is about 5% replacement per year. So actually, something like 89% of UK hives have queens of completely unknown origin, and the beekeepers really don't actively replace them and don't often know what bees they've got at all. And that question of what bees they've got is well worth asking. So what about the native honeybee? So of course our native honeybee is the dark European honeybee, Apis mellifera mellifera, and here are a couple of nice pictures. And depending on where you live, this is the English, British, Scottish, Welsh, Cornish, black or brown bee, depending on how you want to describe it. So it's probably best to call it the dark European honeybee. And its natural distribution seems to have been Northern Europe, from parts of Russia right across to France, up to southern Scandinavia. And this map I think correctly shows the British Isles included here, and I'll come on to that in a second. But it's worth just briefly looking at these other races. So we have Ligustica, the Italian bee, the Carniolan bee, Greek bee we were talking about, Turkish bee, and we also have these little populations on islands, so on Sicily, on Crete and Cyprus, each have their own subspecies of bee, and I will come back to that. But on the question of whether this should be coloured in orange, I'm quite happy with that. But a few years ago, well, 2008, in fact, I was prompted to write this paper, Are Honeybees Native to the British Isles? Because some people didn't think they were. And in particular, there was a character who fortunately has now retired, who was the bee specialist in inverted commas for English nature. He didn't like honeybees at all. He was convinced that they'd been imported into Britain, probably by the Normans or possibly by the Romans, but certainly weren't native, certainly didn't exist anymore. They were dreadful things that competed with other species of bee, and that's a whole separate talk. He even went so far as to suggest that they should be removed from nature reserves, and of course that topic keeps coming up as well. But so I was prompted to do this paper and collected together all the evidence that I could find, both biological, historical and archaeological, and I think there is absolutely no doubt that the honeybee has been here in Britain since the end of the last ice age, and before the land bridge disappeared between us and continental Europe. And I was, prompted partly to write it by, being aware of the work of this character, Brother Adam here, probably one of the best known beekeepers, and I think an incredibly innovative and inventive beekeepers. And if you see what he'd done in terms of modernizing the apiaries at Buckfast Abbey by the 1930s, I think he made some major achievements. When it came to genetics and so on, I think he was on less certain ground, and he was certainly good at rearing queens and bee breeding, but he did, because he was promoting his own bees, perpetuate some rather serious myths. And so in particular, he wrote in one of his books, the old English brown bee lives today only in the memory. Some 50 years ago, she fell a victim to the acarine epidemic and was completely wiped out. So first of all, he's talking about the Isle of Wight disease. He was there, I wasn't. So therefore his views have, must carry some ground. But when he calls it the acarine epidemic, that's what people thought it was in the 1920s. They thought it had been caused by the Tracheomite Acarapis woodi. But my former colleague, Bill Bailey, really disproved that in the 1950s and 60s. And as I say, concluded that actually the Isle of Wight disease had been chronic paralysis virus. So I think, he was wrong there, but also where he says that the old English bee was completely wiped out. Clearly lots of colonies did die, but to suggest they were completely wiped out, I think was an exaggeration. And the fact that it was an exaggeration was shown by the fact that around the country from really the 1940s and 50s and 60s particularly, people like Beowulf Cooper became convinced that actually there were lots of native or near native bees around the country. And my attention was particularly drawn to the small island of Colonsay in the Hebrides by this man, Andrew Abrahams, who's the beekeeper there, who has these black bees here. And he contacted me because he was concerned that his, as he thought, native black bees could be damaged if other beekeepers brought other strains of bee to the island. And so he was trying to ensure that they were preserved in some way. And he'd come across Scottish Natural Heritage when he talked about this, and they had consulted the bee expert at English Natural England, who I've already mentioned, and they said, well, no, you know, it's not a good idea to have honeybees because there are rare bumblebees on Colonsay, and if you would like to remove them, that we would certainly support that. But of course, that wasn't what he was after. He was trying to preserve his dark bees, and I'll come back to him a little later. But at around about this time, people started using new molecular techniques to look at the genetics of bees. And this was really the first European study that was of any significance. And they looked at a whole series of bees that were thought to be dark native European honeybees, all these bees up here, Apis mellifera mellifera. And they compared them with African strains of bees and Mediterranean strains of bees. So down here, you've got the Carnica and Lycustica and Anatolica. And then you've got these African bees. And it's worth just noting at this point that actually the Apis mellifera mellifera is more closely related to African bees than it is to Italian or Carniolan bees. And consequently, if you cross them together, you get lots of hybrid vigor and bad-tempered bees. And we might come back to that later. But all these samples were collected from various sites in Europe, France, lots in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, which was where the scientists based, but also a number of studies from Ireland, from Scotland, and from England. And the results were quite interesting. So here we have a grouping. We have Galtei. This is Michael McGillicudder's bees from Ireland, closely related to other Irish bees, but also to Tasmania. Now, I realise Tasmania is not in England, but we do know that bees were taken from England to Tasmania 100 years or so ago, and that there are still black bees there. And here are Andrew Abraham's Colonsay bees, closely related to these, but different. And then we have some Derbyshire bees here, which would have been the East Midlands group of Bibber. But we also have some other bees up here from England that appear to be very closely related to Scandinavian bees. And these bees right at the top here from Grimsby, many of you may remember the late Claire Wilkinson, who lived in Grimsby. Those were her bees, and they proved to be absolutely identical to some Scandinavian bees. And so perhaps the English Natural England expert was right, and that people had brought bees to Britain. Maybe Viking settlers brought bees with them. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility. But anyway, it demonstrated that we do indeed have surviving dark bees present in Britain and Ireland, but it was a very small sample size. But then there was a much larger study carried out by the National Bee Unit, by FARA, in their random apiary survey, and they took a huge number of samples from apiaries all around Britain, really to test the capabilities of their new PCR machines. And they looked at disease and many things, but they also looked at the genetics of the bees. Now, frustratingly, this has never actually been properly published, and so the data are not widely available. But there was a lady called Catherine Thompson who did a PhD at the University of Leeds in association with the National Bee Unit. And in part of her thesis, she was given access to this random apiary survey data. And this point here is the proportion of Apis mellifera mellifera compared to other genes in the sample she looked at. These are the random apiary survey sample, which said that overall, the background of Apis mellifera mellifera in managed colonies in the UK is 41.9%. So it was consistently the most common element in the makeup of bees selected at random across Britain. And these were her study sites, including some islands and very remote locations. And in fact, consistently, her study sites had a higher incidence of Apis mellifera mellifera than in the random apiary survey data. So this is really interesting, and it's really frustrating that this has never been properly published. But moving on, some very recent work over the last few years has really built up our knowledge. So this was Jack Hassett and colleagues working in Ireland, published in 2018, and they were looking at all of these sites across the island of Ireland, and a pretty good random sampling. And they came to the conclusion that Ireland actually has the largest remaining populations of Apis mellifera mellifera anywhere in Europe, although possibly in the Urals in Russia there may be bigger populations, but they're only poorly understood. But in large countries like France and Germany, where there ought to be lots of Apis mellifera mellifera, there seem to be only relic populations. And so the data that came from that show that looking at this is looking at the genetics of these bees. So here, over here, we have Italian bees and Carniolan bees, and Irish bees are here, are very closely related to the European Apis mellifera mellifera, as we would want, and appear to be fairly pure. But interestingly, there seem to be a lot of unique genotypes to Ireland that are not present elsewhere. So these are Apis mellifera mellifera, but they appear to be uniquely Irish genes that are present in these populations, suggesting that you know, they really have been living on their own for a long time. And another study that was carried out a few years ago that I was involved in looked at supposedly protected and unprotected populations of these bees. So here is Andrew Abrahams on Colonsay. Here is the Danish island of Laso, which supposedly was protected. And then we had two other sites, one in southwest France, putatively Varroa-resistant Apis mellifera mellifera, and this was our bees at Sussex University, which actually originally came from the East Midlands group of Bibber when Francis Ratnieks was at Sheffield. And so they looked at these populations and compared them with type specimens of Italian bees and Carniolan bees from Croatia and Serbia. And the results, it's a similar sort of graph to the previous one, but they've very unhelpfully used different colors. So here, Apis mellifera mellifera is the bright blue, and here are some Norwegian bees that prove to be extremely pure. These are Andrew Abrahams bees from Colonsay, which are also very pure. This is a sample from France, which was supposed to be Apis mellifera mellifera, but you can see it really isn't. It's really a great mixture. But these ones here on the left, England, these are our bees from Sussex. And I was really quite pleasantly surprised by how pure they were, bearing in mind that they are not a closed population, and where we keep our bees, there are other beekeepers nearby who keep potentially other strains of bees. So that was quite encouraging. And really all this interest and knowledge, and I should say there are a number of other studies going on in Wales and Scotland as well that haven't yet been published, and also in the southwest of England, and this has really encouraged a lot of interest. Bibber, of course, you know, has a long heritage in looking at bees and in running local groups. I've mentioned one already, but really over the last few years there's been a flowering of interest. There's been the Native Irish Honeybee Society, the Scottish Native Honeybee Society have been formed, and then we've had other groups such as the B4 project in the southwest of England. And indeed, the B4 project a couple of years ago announced the first native honeybee research, which I think is excellent at raising awareness of native bees. So what about the buckfast bee that some people like? Well, I've mentioned Brother Adam already, and of course, if you read his books, you can find out what he said about his bees. He's been dead a few years now, but buckfast bees are still popular around the world. And a while back, I thought, well, let's look at buckfast bees and see what they're like. And so I looked for pictures of buckfast bees on the internet, and I came up with these. And you can see that buckfast bees can really be quite dark, or they can be quite stripy, or they can be quite orange, or really very brown. And of course, what this shows is that buckfast bees are themselves extremely variable. And of course, if you talk to buckfast breeders, they will show you a pedigree that they have all the way back to Brother Adam's first crosses, and I don't doubt that. But nonetheless, they have been selecting the bees under different conditions in Germany, in Denmark and elsewhere, and they've produced really very different bees, which I'm sure may be marvelous for those particular conditions, but it doesn't follow that they would be the best bee for you or me in even different parts of Britain. But lots of people like them. And what about the other imported bees? So as well as buckfast bees, most of the bees imported into Britain come from two major populations, the Italian bees and the Carniolan bees. And they've spread around the world. Particularly the Italian bee is found all around the world. And you would imagine, therefore, that there's no threat to it at all. But in fact, in parts of Italy, there's a suggestion that Italian bees are being lost and mixed up with other strains of bee. Carniolan bees, depends where you go. If you go to Slovenia, they are protected by law and very jealously guarded. But in other areas where they're native, actually, they've been mixed up with other strains of bee from elsewhere, particularly over in the border with Macedonica bees and so on. And so there are, in fact, attempts to ensure that these strains of bees are kept pure. And when we come down to the small islands like Sicily and Crete and Cyprus, there is indeed, and Malta, there is a very real risk that those unique bee populations are being lost through the movement of bees. And so very recently, the International Council for the Conservation of Nature commissioned the EU to look into the question of, these two strains of bee in particular, could they be threatened, and could they act as invasive species outside their native range? And so my two colleagues, Maria Buger and Per Krieger, were commissioned to write this. And again, I think the reference is in the paper and it's worth looking at. And they concluded that, yes, indeed, these things could act as an invasive species outside their range. And they suggest various possible solutions to the problem and things that can be done to ameliorate the problem. So what bees do UK beekeepers really want? It's not the same question as what can they get, it's what do they want. And so fortunately, a couple of years ago, DEFRA did carry out a survey of queen replacement practices. And I have to say this wasn't widely publicised, but nonetheless, the results are quite interesting. And I have to thank Kevin Beattie from DEFRA for allowing me to use some of this data. So looking through some of the questions, are you or would you be interested in knowing the heritage of your queens before purchase? And nearly 80% of the respondents said, yes, they would. Do you think the mixing of native and imported honeybee strains is positive, negative, or don't know? And 46% said it was negative, 42% didn't know, but only 12% of people thought that it was a positive thing. Would you be interested in buying queens from an accredited UK source? There's currently no government accreditation scheme. Yes, 65% of the respondents said they would, and 19% said they wouldn't. Would you be in favour of a national breeding programme for England based on native or near-native subspecies of Apis mellifera mellifera? A national breeding programme could concentrate on propagating native or near-native bees whilst reducing contact with imported bees. Great. And nearly 80% of the respondents said yes, they would. That would be a good idea. However, when we come to this question, if yes, would you wish to rear queens as part of this programme? Sadly, only 30% said they would, 40% said they wouldn't, and the other 30% said they didn't know. and this is really rather disappointing. And I think this really comes back to where we started, as to perhaps an explanation for why we are importing so many queens. So let's just think about queen rearing in Britain and Ireland for a minute. So, as we've seen from the figures, few beekeepers practice queen rearing. There are few commercial queen rearing operations. You know, you can really count the number of big queen rearers on the fingers of one hand, and there are quite a lot of small queen rearers who produce a small number, but really there's not a lot of commercial queen rearing going on. And as we've seen, actually few beekeepers buy queens. So why is bee breeding, queen rearing, so difficult in Britain and Ireland? Well, of course, one factor is the weather, and then there's the weather and the weather and the weather. And that, unfortunately, really, I think, is the major problem. The climate for producing queens in Britain is wonderful, perfect. The weather is often terrible, particularly at the times of year when you want to get queens mated. And so, unfortunately, you can do absolutely everything correctly, and you can get really good results, or you can do it just as correctly, and due to no fault of your own, you can get a total failure in your production. And that makes it difficult to reliably produce what we want, and it makes it difficult to actually make a viable business, and it makes queens very expensive in this country. But when you actually ask people why they import queens, a lot of the reasons they give for importing queens are actually reasons why you should regularly replace queens, like controlling swarming and so on. So they're not really reasons for importing queens, but others will of course tell you that their imported bees are better than the local ones. Well, you know, that's great to say, and you know, lots of people will say, oh yeah, my bees were rubbish until I imported X, and then my honey yields increased. But of course, you know, they weren't carrying out a controlled experiment, and lots of other things could have been better in the recent years when they got good honey yields. And it wasn't a controlled scientific study. And the best controlled scientific study that I know of, really the only one I know of, is the Kolos GEI experiment that I mentioned earlier. And as I say, they measured many things in their study, one of which was honey production. And these two graphs are honey production. These are different strains of bees here. So various Carniolan bees, various Italian bees, and then over here the Greek bees and Apis mellifera mellifera. And this does indeed appear to show that the strains of bee that we think produce lots of honey did produce lots of honey. But you do need to be cautious in interpreting this data, because there was a bias in the design of the experiment, not deliberate, but a bias in that the sites where the weather conditions are conducive to producing lots of honey tended to be the sites where the Carniolan and Italian bees were tested. So there is a bias in the data. You do need to be cautious in interpreting it. But what I can say is that significantly and consistently at each site, the local strain of bee, whatever it was, gathered more honey than the non-local ones. So that is a consistent result, and certainly doesn't suggest that importing a bee from somewhere else is necessarily going to get you more honey. One of the factors that also could have contributed to the results in the experiment is Varroa tolerance, because the colonies were not treated for Varroa. And that begs the question, are there Varroa tolerant bees around in the world? And yes, indeed, there are. I have personal experience of one strain here, in one element here, in that at Sussex University, we've been breeding disease-resistant hygienic strains of bee, and we were able to demonstrate in a few years that by selecting for the freeze-killed brood bioassay, and here it is, you freeze a circle of brood, or sealed brood, which kills it. You then look at it 2 days later, and you look at the proportion that's been removed, and if you have good hygienic bees here, they remove it all, and if you have bad, poor hygienic bees, they don't remove it. And on that basis, you can select, and we found that by selecting and then rearing from those hygienic bees, within a short time, you can produce bees that are hygienic, that have a lower population of Varroa, and indeed have a lower incidence of deformed wing virus. But that's just one way of doing it. And as part of EuroBest, we've also asked to look at the state of play for the production and keeping of Varroa-resistant bees in Europe. And fortunately, this has been written up, and this has just been submitted to a journal a few days ago, and hopefully will be published very rapidly. And really, we were searching the literature to do a review of what's known about Varroa-tolerant bees, but also what's known about Varroa-tolerant populations in Europe, by asking people who bred them and worked with them and people in this country. And the conclusion is that yes, there are quite a lot of Varroa resistant or Varroa tolerant strains of bee around Europe, some arising from deliberate breeding programs like the one at Sussex, but many others from naturally occurring survivor populations. And in fact, at the moment, there is a current survey that's being done by another part of COLOS, the Survivors Task Force, actually asking for information. So if you know of places where there are populations, that is more than 5 colonies, which have been left untreated for a number of years and still survive, then please fill in this questionnaire. There are quite a few hundred replies the last I heard, and I know that there are a number of populations in Britain and Ireland that have been identified. So if you know of such bees, please fill in the survey. So really coming towards the end here, the future of bee breeding in Britain and Ireland. Well, I think the major problem, the major reason, apart from the weather, or perhaps because of the weather, is that we're not very good at bee breeding in Britain because we don't have any kind of structure. Although we've had the local groups and enthusiastic people around the country that I've mentioned, we do not have any kind of a structure of a queen rearing industry in this country. We do have local breeding groups, and indeed I think that is really the best way to go. There are very few individual beekeepers who have enough colonies to run a breeding or selection program themselves, but most beekeeping associations have enough colonies to do something useful if they want to. And I think all the evidence points to the fact that the starting point should be local bees. And from my point of view, I think I can say that actually, carefully selecting bees for some good characteristic is great, but it does require effort. But any beekeeper can improve their bees by culling out the bad ones. So if you get rid of the colonies that show signs of disease, you get rid of the bad-tempered ones, you can make very rapid progress. And really that takes me on to the purpose of this series of seminars, is the National Honeybee Improvement Programme, which I think is a marvellous innovation and something that should be successful. And so to conclude, really, my view is that the best bee for you is probably the one you have already. And that's not to say that it can't be improved. So in many parts of the country, this will be near native bees. In some other parts of the country, they may be much more mixed up, but that doesn't mean they can't be improved. And so to go back to my starting point, this was the Healthy Bees Plan, which was, to my mind, slightly disappointing in that it didn't mention queen rearing or bee breeding. This is the new draft of the Healthy Bees Plan 2030, which will go out for public consultation very soon. I was told September, we're now October, but it will be very soon. It will go out for public consultation. The draft I have seen does at least mention queen rearing as being a desirable thing, which is a great improvement. But my understanding is that DEFRA has at present been reluctant to commit itself to any kind of bee breeding program, but if loads of people write in and say it should, then perhaps we can change things. So I will end there and leave you with some useful websites. That's our own Facebook page. This is the IBRA website, where a lot of the papers from the GEI experiment can be found. This is Colos's website, and this is the Lassie University of Sussex website. And in fact, this Facebook page for Colos is where the Colos conference is going to be held next Monday. And on Facebook, any beekeeper will be able to tune in and listen to the Colos conference. The program will cover updates on all of the different Colos activities. So I shall end there, and I will endeavour to answer your questions.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Norman. That was pretty comprehensive. Well done, thanks very much indeed. We've got quite a lot of questions come in. Some of them, I'm afraid, are asking for your opinion, which you might not want to give. But
depends what they ask.
All you got to say is no comment. Norman did mention an article in Beecraft. Somebody has come in and said that it's in the July Beecraft, and it is actually downloadable online. So that's an answer for that. Some of these may not be too relevant to your talk, Norman, but I think I'll probably try and give most of them if I can anyway. This is a bit of a strange one, but it's pretty obvious for ordinary beekeepers. How local does local need to be?
Yeah, that's
excuse me, I'm not sure whether it was in relation to in this country or the Colos study.
Well, I have been asked this before, and it does relate to the Colos study, but it is of great importance, and of course it all depends. And so on a local basis, if we're talking about the island of Malta, you are talking about this tiny little island that has its own really unique population, which has been there in an island. Elsewhere, you may have large areas where the bees have mixed over a very large area over a very large period of time, and will not vary much. In Britain, we have areas of high density, and one of the characteristics of Britain is that the geology and the microclimate change over very small distances, and so it might be, if you happen to live in some part of the country where you're in a unique little valley, it might be your bee population is unique to that valley. On the other hand, if you're in a flat area, local may be a much larger area. So I don't think there's any single answer. It depends on your particular circumstances, and needs a bit of thought in each individual case. I realise that's not a terribly satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can do.
From the graph Norman has shared on local versus imported bees, despite the local winning out on imports, both graphs are downward. I wonder why.
Well, bees do die. Colonies do die out, and these colonies were not treated for varroa. So when they either died or got to a really parlous state, they were withdrawn from the experiment. So that's why ultimately the graphs go down for all. If they'd been treated for varroa, you would have got a different result. But the scientists deliberately wanted to exclude that. So yes, all colonies do die, and interestingly, colonies don't go on forever. They do die out after a number of years, and we as beekeepers often don't notice that because we're constantly requeening and uniting colonies, and we're not really aware of the natural life of a colony.
Does Norman think that the importation of bees should be banned or licensed in some way to help control the incidence of bee viruses?
I cover this in the article, but it's not really a question of whether I think they should or shouldn't be banned. I don't think they will be. I don't think it's very likely that we will ever be in a legal position to ban imports. I mean, many have suggested that, of course, Brexit is the perfect opportunity to ban things, but sooner or later we will have to reach some kind of trade agreement with the EU, and I think we can almost guarantee that that will end up being very similar in terms of allowing free movement of animals and plants to the one we have already. But even if there was to be such a ban, I don't think it would be enforceable. There's really nothing to stop people bringing in queens in their top pocket and so on. But as I say in the article, I think that's slightly immaterial. If we can produce lots of queens ourselves, we reduce the incentive for people importing queens, and I think that's a much more important factor.
Yeah, I think that's really what NatPip is aiming at. This one was very definitely not written by me, Norman. Could the recent higher importation of queens be related to the apparently increasing problem with queens being superseded?
Well, I mean, certainly if queens are being superseded, people need to rear more queens and replace queens, but don't necessarily have to import them.
Do you know the genetic makeup of the bees imported from New Zealand and Australia? Was there much AMM content in them?
I think most of them, certainly the ones I've seen over the years, have been very much Italian.
They're bright yellow, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, some of these New Zealand ones were incredibly bright, pale, and beautiful bees, but totally unsuitable for this country. So yes, there are certainly these Apis mellifera bees still in Tasmania, but as far as I'm aware, they're certainly not available to anyone here.
Do we have a rare breed centre as used for cattle in the UK yet for AMM to preserve a breeding stock for the future?
Well, not as such, but there are various groups around Britain and Ireland trying to do that, and of course I mentioned the B4 group in Cornwall, who at Mount Edgecombe Country Park have this black bee reserve. But I think it's fair to say that is mainly to raise awareness rather than having a large enough population to act as a reserve. The problem, of course, with honeybees is that they fly around and mate in a way that cattle, sheep, or pigs don't.
I just realised there was a second part of that, but you basically answered it anyway. If importing queens exposes their bees to different strains of viruses, is it the same for moving bees from county to county within the UK?
It could quite well be, yes. I mean, I mentioned the bee program that we set up at Sussex to breed hygienic bees, and as I say, these were originally bees that Francis Ratnieks brought down from Sheffield that came from the East Midlands group of Bibber, and we did toy with the idea of, since we've got black bees, we should try some other black bees, and we tried to get hold of other bees. So we had some of Michael McGillicudder's bees, we had some of James Kilty's bees from Cornwall, we had some bees from Northern Ireland, we had some bees from Northumberland, we tried to get some black bees from Austria, and well, we failed there, but all the other ones proved to be very disappointing and almost universally went down with very high incidence of chalk brood, and within a couple of years we'd lost all of those, and that seemed annoying at the time, but in hindsight, having looked at the results of the GEI experiment, it's absolutely clear that those poor bees were being exposed to a different strain of chalk brood that they hadn't been exposed to before, and really shows it don't work moving them around, because I'm sure they were all marvellous bees wherever they came from, but they didn't do well in Sussex.
Do you have any comments on the use of Russian bees in the USA? This is a big question, but your thoughts will be interesting. I'm thinking of the program run by Thomas Rinderer and colleagues and the assessment and transfer of these bees to the commercial sector.
Yes. Well, so for anyone not familiar with this story, the idea is that the far east of Russia was the place where Varroa was first noted to be a major problem with Apis mellifera. And so the logic is that they've been exposed to Varroa longer than any other bees, and that in time a parasite and its host reach a sort of working relationship where the host should become resistant and the parasite should become less virulent. And so this group, led by Tom Rinderer, imported these bees into the United States some years ago, first of all in quarantine, and then they've been experimenting with them ever since. And I think they very quickly realized that these bees are indeed tolerant to Varroa, and they've been trying to understand what the mechanism was. But my understanding is, even though they are commercially available in the United States, they're not particularly good from other characteristics of temper, honey production, and so on. So, they're not the panacea for all ills that I think they were hoped to be.
Would you be able to clarify which paper it was for the Greek apiary showing disease incidence in non-local and local colonies, please?
Yeah, so if you can find on the IBRA website the special issue, which was in 2014.
So excuse me, Norman, you broke up a bit. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sorry. So if you go to the IBRA website, or in fact, actually, if you go to the Colos website, there's a whole page about the GEI experiment with all the papers listed and links to them. It's the paper by Roy Francis and colleagues. I can't remember the title, but it's talking about disease. It's quite easy to find. And I think the reference is in the Beecraft article as well.
Right. I think we'll call a close there, Norman. Okay. Yeah, the attendances are dropping off just a shade. Yep. Thanks very much indeed for a really good talk. And don't forget, everybody, that there's another 6 to come, I think, including a questions and answer session. So if you've got any more questions, please send them in, and we'll try and answer them on the day. Thanks very much for listening, and thank you very much indeed, Norman. Next week should be Peter Jenkins. Thank you all.
Okay, goodbye everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.